So the purpose of this webinar is to identify components of evidence-based school counselling programs and use that knowledge to identify programs that are available on the web. The last few weeks of the course, we will be looking more in depth at programs that support school counsellors' work in the academic, career and personal social domains. And for your final projects, you will have to examine different programs that will support your future work at different levels of practice within the ASCA national model. For example, in week 9, we will look in depth at CUDA and Naviance, which are two premier programs that help students in their career and college planning. Nonetheless, I thought that we should first examine the notion of evidence-based practice and discuss how that concept applies to our work and how do we go about critically evaluating programs. So the lesson objectives are to identify the type of student data for determining program and intervention priorities. This is important to review, as when we are searching for programs, we need to know what type of outcomes we're trying to impact. Second, we are going to fine-tune our skills for accessing web-based resources, supportive evidence-based programs, or interventions for academic, career and personal social interventions. Evidence-based school counselling. So before we jump in to examining specific resources, we need to take a step back and clarify what do we mean by the term evidence-based school counselling. First, it's important to note that evidence-based practices originated in the medical field, not in the educational field, and it's really associated with identifying treatments for physical health problems. Evidence-based in the medical realm usually means that a treatment has been subject to randomized clinical trials in order to demonstrate efficacy. Obviously, evidence-based treatments in education are not always subject to such vigorous testing, as it's really hard to justify and even coordinate randomization in a school district. Nonetheless, it does mean that a program is associated with student achievement in some particular area. Unlike medicines for physical ailments, evidence-based treatments to ameliorate an educational deficit do not work all the time with all populations in all schools. And so recognizing that context is really everything, the Federal Department of Education suggests that evidence-based practice equals professional wisdom combined with empirical evidence. So what is this term, professional wisdom? Professional wisdom is about it's like being tuned into one's local circumstances, and it's related to judgment that individuals will require through experience. It includes identifying and using local data to make decisions about local practice, what will work in this school, in this community with our students. And personally, I think it's really wonderful that the feds have added this dimension to evidence-based practice in schools, as really all too often I've been in schools where consultants would arrive from far and wide and try and market programs to us or try and have us implement programs that we were given absolutely no say in. And so I really appreciate the fact that the federal government recognises that teachers and school counsellors have rich local knowledge about what goes on in their schools and what will work in their schools, and that should be a factor in considering whether or not you're going to adopt a program. And so what is empirical research in education? The obvious answer is that it's research conducted in educational settings. However, there's also considerable overlapping or complementary research generated from other disciplines such as psychology, sociology, economics, and neuroscience. And as school counsellors, we also do not teach a content area, so we need to seek out research that demonstrates how social emotional factors impact achievement too. And this is often located outside the field of education. Also worth noting is that evaluation done at the local level is also empirical research. And this may be when local stakeholders, including school counsellors, examine the impact or the effectiveness of a particular program they're implementing. So I don't want to get too far off track, but I put this slide in just to give you an overview of evidence-based school counselling model, what the different components are. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're really looking at how to use outcome-based research to become consumers of the programs and the information that's out there. And so with that in mind, what type of data, what type of outcomes are we looking for? And so really the cherry on the cake is the achievement data. And that's going to include our college going rates, graduation data, dropout rates, GPAs, graduation rates, anything that could be is very quantified. And so about 10 years ago, so it's worth doing a little history lesson here, about 10 years ago when it became apparent that school counsellors need to align themselves with the accountability movement and prove that they too can impact this really important achievement data, school counsellors and counsellor educators got really caught up in this notion that school counsellors must show how they impact these hard outcomes. The problem is so many stakeholders are vested and have a hand in contributing to outcomes in the achievement data field that it's really hard to peel it back and say that the school counsellors, there's a direct link between school counsellors' work and achievement data, particularly when they're not teaching a content area. Well, they're not teaching in a content area. So more fruitful is for school counsellors to try and tie their activities to achievement-related data and perception data. And so achievement-related data can include attendance, course enrollment patterns, discipline events, homework completion, school engagement, study skills usage. And so while achievement-related data is not the perfect outcome in and of itself, we know that if a kid comes to school every day, if his or her attendance is good, you know what, their achievement's going to be relatively okay too. We know that if students are engaged in school, academically, socially, and psychologically, achievement goes up. And school counsellors often implement programs that directly impact these achievement-related indicators. For example, I've had kiddos on behavioural contracts to improve their attendance. I've also directly taught study skills to enhance their study habits. So when we begin to evaluate programs in terms of being evidence-based, so to speak, programs can really attest to their quality by including evidence that they've impacted this achievement-related data too. So the third type of data is going to be perception data. And similar to achievement-related data, school counsellors can have far more success demonstrating the value of their work through highlighting shifts in perception. And perception data really relates to attitude, knowledge, and skills, and can be often garnered by school counsellors in a pre-post-test fashion. The main rule of thumb when using perception data is that you use instruments that relate to the intervention. So if you're running an anxiety group, assess your students' anxiety before and after the intervention. Like achievement-related data, perception data connects to hard outcome achievement data, but it's really up to the school counsellors to show that linkage. So if a child is depressed and he or she is not coming to school because of their depression, a school counsellor may provide direct intervention or connect the child with services, which result in a decrease in depression and an increase in school attendance, which in turn improves the students' school achievement. And so you can see the link between these different data points. And so once again, when you're looking for programs, producers may use evidence of perception data to show program efficacy. It's just important for us to understand how each data point interlocks with the next. And for example, if a program on anxiety doesn't actually doesn't say that it improves school achievement, it may be up to us to say that yes, but anxiety is linked to low anxiety is linked to higher school engagement, which is associated with school achievement. So it's really, that's part of our knowledge base and skill set, is to understand the links between these different data sources. So demographic data is another factor to consider when evaluating the merit of a particular program. If the publisher of a program does not share demographic data related to the research they're espousing as evidence that a program works, then we have to be critical about whether or not it would work with our population. I'm not saying that it won't work, but it's nice to know in advance with which populations a particular program has been successful. So, for example, I've worked in very different schools. When I was in South Texas, I worked at a bilingual school. In Memphis, I worked at a small private Jewish school. Programs that worked in those different settings were very, very different. And so, and I'll talk in a little bit later in this webinar, I'll talk about facing history, facing ourselves. But that's a very good anti-bullying program. It's good for teaching tolerance, and all these wonderful things come out of that program. But it's primarily been normed with a Jewish population. So I'm not sure if it would work with my bilingual school in South Texas. Okay, so I just tossed this slide in here because oftentimes when you guys have studied the ASCA national model, ASCA mentions that school counsellors use process data of evidence of their activities. And I will say process data is wonderful information. It really shows us where we've been working, who we've been working with. However, it doesn't in and of itself show outcomes. So in terms of like evaluating programs for efficacy, process data is really probably the least relevant data point. So now let's talk a little bit about how do we go about locating evidence-based programs. So once you've identified whatever the problem is in your school, the next step is to find an empirically informed intervention. And programs can be fully online, as is the case in CUDA that we'll be using next week, or may have a website where you can order pen and paper curriculum. Whatever their format, your search is most likely to begin on the web. And so with this slide, I just wanted to highlight some tools that will help you locate what research has been conducted, with whom, and in what settings. For example, if my data indicates that anxiety is a problem, I may begin searching the web for an anxiety program that I can use with my middle school girls. And one tool that I really like is Google Scholar. It's a free search engine which allows us to search peer-reviewed sources and books, particularly as you exit your master's program. You won't have access to the library databases anymore. So Google Scholar is a great default. So you can begin searching on Google Scholar by a particular presenting problem, such as anxiety among middle school girls. And if there is a full text access for free, Google Scholar will provide you with a link to the resource. I also like that it allows you to select a date range, so you can really search programs that have been researched in the past 10 years. If you're an ACA or ASCA member, you will have access to their journals, which may have research articles relevant to the presenting problem. And also your school library may subscribe to a relevant educational journal. So it's also worth highlighting some outcome research resources that will help you narrow down an evidence-based program. The first on the list is the Centre for Disease Control, and that primarily has health-related resources. Since school counsellors are often the campus provider of health and wellness information, they may find many useful resources on the CDC website. Particularly relevant are the drug and alcohol education and healthy relationships and wellness resources. CASEL, which is a collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, is a phenomenal website dedicated to demonstrating how social and emotional learning is instrumental to academic outcomes. So it's a great resource for school counsellors. It also provides a resource guides for social and emotional programming that have research efficacy. It's also worth noting it's very focused on elementary and middle school. Unfortunately, there's not as much evidence or research around programs, particularly prevention-based programs that work at the high school level. And I often think that, once students reach that operational stage of development, that they have more fixed knowledge about who they are in the world, and it gets harder and harder to impact them with kind of exposure to new information and ideas. They're just a lot less malleable than students in elementary and middle school. So as you're looking for resources, do explore CASEL. Also, the Frederickson Center of School Counseling Outcome Research and Evaluation pulls together a variety of resources related to different topics. It also operates the annual Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference, and it also recently launched an open access journal of school-based counseling policy and evaluation. It's open access, which means that once you graduate, you'll be able to access that journal without having to be a member or without having to pay $20 to access an article. I should have also put it up there, but the Journal of School Counseling, not ASCA's counseling, not ASCA's journal, but the Journal of School Counseling is also a free open access journal that just has a really rich database of research articles related to a variety of top school counseling topics. So I should have put that up there, but just put, remember that one too. Let's see. So the National Centre for Educational Research, obviously that focuses more on academic research, but there is overlapping research, particularly related to attendance, dropout and college going. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, have intervention guides related to PTSD, trauma and anxiety. And the What Works Clearinghouse is also a really interesting database. It's put out by the federal government and reviews existing research on different programs, products and practices in education. It has a very high standards, so it's a really good tool for locating evidence-based practices related to just a variety of issues in education. And just so there's a lot of information on just broad-based student achievement as it relates to math, English, etc. But they do have Dropout Prevention Guide, which is really helpful to school counsellors. Okay, so response to intervention, levels of intervention. RTI and PBIS systems really provide an elegant way to conceptualize levels of service from a systems-wide perspective. And so as you are searching for different programs, also research the delivery format, as this will help you to discern whether a program is suitable for classroom guidance, individual or group work. If a program is used at the classroom level, this will correspond to Tier 1 and will be suitable for prevention-based guidance work. So the next few slides document many programs that have been determined as evidence-based by the Frederickson Center for School Counseling Outcome Research and Evaluation. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them, but I really do encourage you to explore these. So Too Good for Violence is an evidence-based K-12 violence prevention program that provides curriculum materials, teaching materials, parent materials, and it's one of the few programs that extends to high school. Other programs are PATHS, an evidence-based program that extends to middle school and is based on cognitive behavioral therapy principles. This program teaches students to consider different ways to perceive a situation, and it too provides classroom-based materials. Many of these programs can be modified with students in small groups and individually. They also range in price. Some of them are free and some of them are quite pricey, but they all have evidence that they work. And so, as I mentioned, that most resources are for elementary and middle school students, and developmentally speaking, when students reach that formal operational level, prevention type work is just less effective. So these are some sample Tier 2 evidence programs for at-risk group students. So this is really going to correspond to our work with small students in small group intervention. The Incredible Years was initially designed to work with students with conduct disorder, but has now been expanded, and the research indicates that it's really effective for students with ADHD and other behavioral issues, which may not be quite as severe as conduct disorder. You'll also note that some of the Tier 1 programs reappear on the list. And basically, there's going to be elements of these programs that are suitable to work in small groups and individually. So the final slide on this laundry list of evidence-based programs is going to be our sample Tier 3 programs. You'll notice that PBIS, which really has been instrumental in in pioneering evidence-based programs that target behavioral problems at different levels of intensity. That's on the list. Others are reoccurring as they've been adapted to one-on-one intervention. One program that's worth highlighting is Coping Cats, which is one of the very few evidence-based programs for anxiety that's been used in the school. And like a lot of these programs, it's available on Amazon, but how would you know this is a good program? And so it's available on Amazon, and it's a manualized program, and it comes with a training manual too. And so with a lot of these programs, you're going to have to also ask the publishers to, you may have to write to them and ask them to share with you their research if it's not readily available on the program's website. So while the previous slides provide examples of evidence-based programs as determined by the Frederickson Center, they represent only a fraction of all the programs out there. And so how does one determine if a program's evidence-based if it's not on that list? And if so, would it work in my school with my kids? So here are some questions you can deploy when determining if a program is a good fit. So first is there published research? And what is the magnitude or the extent of this research? Was it just based on a single study, or have there been multiple studies across different school contexts with different school populations? The OWIUS, I'm probably sure I'm not saying that right. The OWIUS bullying program has been really extensively researched, and this is evident both on the website, on its website, and the number of published research articles. By contrast, I served on a dissertation committee that examined the efficacy of the Kids on the Block program that teaches anti-bullying and tolerance through a puppet show. This is a really lovely, whimsy intervention, but it's only a one-time intervention, and while it seems to immediately improve the kids' knowledge and skills, so we can gather perception data related to, pre-post, kids seem to have more knowledge about how to report bullying after the program, but there was no long-term outcome data about whether it actually reduced incidences of bullying. Was there less office discipline referrals related to bullying? So while it's a very sweet program, if I was going to adopt that as a school counsellor, I would also probably have to supplement it with my own programming. As I mentioned, also, did the program work across a homogenous population, or was it a diverse group of students? As I mentioned, I worked in a small private Jewish school, and we implemented Facing History, Facing Ourselves to teach tolerance and anti-bullying. And it really worked well in that context, as there was multiple references to the plight of the Jewish people. And the research supported that it works well in this setting, but there was no evidence to suggest that this program would translate to other school contexts. I'm not saying it wouldn't work, but you just have to, when you're adopting programs, just keep that in the back of your, or really the front of your mind, that this is your field, you're pioneering a new program in many ways if it hasn't been normed, or it hasn't been, if the research hasn't been generated from a school with a similar demographic to your own. Let's see what else. Did the authors use valid and reliable measures to demonstrate program efficacy? And this would be a really important question to ask at Tier 2 and Tier 3 programs, where school counsellors are working with students with clinical issues. You'd want the program producers to use a valid measure related to a target issue. For example, if I'm using a trauma-based program, I would want to know that the program impacts trauma as measured by an empirical instrument such as the CPSS. If the authors use perception data, were they able to connect it with achievement and achievement-related data? If so, how? Is the program too long or too short? Some programs that have worked really well with children and adolescents in clinical mental health settings wouldn't automatically translate to, or they're not amenable to school settings. Perhaps they're just too long. Perhaps they've got a very long parent component. Some of the clinical treatments that bring the parents in, it can last for up to 20 sessions. We just don't have that type of time and resources in the schools. So these are all good questions that you should be asking yourself before you consider adopting a program. And as you're researching programs on the web, it may help you kind of narrow it down what would be a suitable program to to either adopt or just, you know, spend your time looking into. And so that concludes our webinar on evidence-based or how to evaluate evidence-based programming for schools. Based on this webinar, you should be able to take quiz 8, and I will now sign off. Okay, thank you, goodbye.